Okay, thank you all for joining today. Today we have Hyunsu joining us for his job talk. Hyunsu is a PhD student from Carnegie Mellon, actually from the same lab as me. Most of us have either worked with Hyunsu directly or heard about his work. I was looking at his profile. He actually had 6 or 7 papers with S2 at this point. So his work, a lot of it is around what we care about, like science research support tools. But he also has other line of work around like ideation, and he published in both HCI and AI venues. So I guess, Hyunsu, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Awesome. Let me start sharing my screen.
I guess one quick question: do you prefer questions during your talk or at the end?
If anyone has like burning questions, I don't mind. But other than that, I kind of timed it a little bit to be like 45 minutes. And so if you can save your questions to the end, that will work too. So. Alrighty, so I guess everyone can see my screen clearly. Just give a thumbs up. Perfect. So yeah, thank you for the kind intro, Joseph, and thank you for being here. My name is Hyunsu Kang, and today I'll be talking about conceptual abstraction and how AI and interaction design may support that to accelerate scientific innovation. So I want to start by taking a moment to marvel at the amazing scientific progress that's spectacularly expanding the scope of questions that we can explore. So on the left is 첨성대, which means near the start place in Korean, one of the oldest still standing observatories today. And on the right is the famed James Webb Telescope, which is orbiting the second Lagrange point where no humans have reached so far. So to literally like look back in time to observe the earliest moments of the universe and opening up huge new spaces for physics in the process. We can trace back the important steps on the way of this progress, and we see notable junctures in the history of sciences that led to significant conceptual shifts. And across them all, we find that it is the new abstractions that changed how we think. So for example, in 1609, Johannes Kepler laid out the trailblazing groundwork that shifted the prevailing model from Ptolemy's geocentrism to heliocentrism. His work also greatly influenced Isaac Newton's thinking, providing the empirical data and foundation for his work on universal gravitation and Principia Mathematica. But what about the rate of progress? So economists have been studying this empirically, and one of the most well-studied data is from the Moore's Law, which is one of the key drivers of economic growth for the past 50 or so years. It shows that the growth rate has stayed remarkably regular, doubling about the number of transistors packed onto an integrated circuit every 2 years. So this rate also equals to about 35% constant growth rate, which has enabled amazing progress in information technology and the economic productivity growth overall. But beneath this surface of regularity is the significantly more research input that goes into the growth. So the number of PhDs granted and the funding also grows almost every year, but more rapidly than the growth rate shown in the Moore's Law. Meaning that the unit of growth is getting much more expensive. So this implies that the rate of scientist productivity growth is kind of slowing, and the pattern is observed over and over again in many other fields as well. Not only that, other data also corroborate this hypothesis. For example, the stagnant quality increase among the Nobel Prize-winning discoveries in physics. Or if we look at how the disruptiveness of ideas in science and engineering is changing over time. And so in a recent paper by Park et al. Found that research findings are increasingly trending consolidatory rather than disruptive in nature. So what's causing the slowing growth in scientist productivity? Isaac Newton, again, famously said, stand on the shoulders of giants to emphasize the importance of pre-existing synthesis for making new challenges tractable in a single human's brain. Newton himself learned partial abstractions from Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, as well as the Descartes' analytic paradigm, which he used as foundations to his calculus problem. But accumulating knowledge seems to be contributing to increasing the age of first invention and great scientific achievements, as Jones showed in his work. In addition, while many fields have seen an exponential growth in the number of publications the past several decades, a study by Milojevic shows the conceptual diversity has grown only so linearly, so widening the gap between the two over time. So what I argue then is what we need is new tools for helping people to synthesize useful cross-cutting abstractions from knowledge and to effectively organize knowledge with those abstractions while also using them to find novel cross-domain insights. So the vision here is to sort of help make tools for systematically finding great ideas to enhance scientists' productivity. So in this talk, I will present my PhD research in 3 parts. In part 1, how research threads can be useful as a cross-cutting abstraction to support organization and discovery across many papers. In part 2, I'll introduce a different schema-based abstraction that goes beyond the local signals from citation graphs that thread-based abstractions rely on to help people find cross-domain insights. And in the last part, I'll present an ongoing project on designing large language model augmented inspiration support systems. So for part 1, I developed 2 tools to help people to effectively read papers along salient threads of research and expand their synthesis to other papers along those abstractions. The critical challenges that these tools tackle have to do with the complexity involved in parsing and understanding depth of cutting-edge research papers and piecing together important insights. Scientists do build up thread of research while reading, identify high and low-level interesting threads, but this synthesis is challenged because threads of research are scattered within many pages of a single paper and across multiple relevant papers, and they are also interleaved with other supporting or contrasting threads and references. So to address these challenges, I developed a system called Thready. Thready aims at helping readers and scientists efficiently leverage other experts' synthesis to facilitate their own understanding of prior art. So while reading, scientists find useful synthesis provided by others, which is in the description of contributions combined with a group of relevant references. But it's really not that easy to capture this due to the high cognitive and interaction costs involved in the process. For one, there are several manual self-tests that the scientist has to go through, such as looking up the references in the bibliography of a paper, finding its details, then saving it into a reference manager, along with saving useful clippings of the context from the text. These subtasks would then need to be repeated for each citation in a thread and a thread in a paper. The scientists would also need to organize the threads into a larger structure. An example shown here, nesting, cross-referencing, and in-situ summaries under augmented reading. So it's easy to see how these would really add up to the demand of reading that's already there. So we aimed for Thready's interaction design to bridge this gap, which includes streamlining extraction and organization of threads while reading, and to resurface relevant threads to contextualize the synthesized information, and to help readers find relevant additional papers to read next to further reduce the context switching cost. So here's the Thready in action. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Let me play the video. Okay, so as you can see, when the user opens a paper PDF on the browser, Thready replaces the default browser PDF renderer with its own interface. Users start by directly highlighting a useful patch of text in the PDF that describes relevant threads, which Thready then extracts references for in the interface that the user can save together. Users can also see details and relevant paper recommendations in a model that expands out, where the user can save any papers to the thread while reading and exploring. So when the user opens up one of the new papers, Thready PDF, here, just give me a moment, we'll load it up with the current data, so synced across the browser tabs, and the user can, kind of continue on to directly highlight in the PDF to synthesize from his new readings. So that's kind of the overview of how Thready works. And let me move here. Okay, so kind of zooming to the interface and its implementation, Thready is implemented as a Google Chrome plugin. So when a user opens a PDF with Thready installed on their browser, it automatically detects it, sends the PDF to the backend server to parse, and replaces the default browser PDF viewer with its own interface. Thready workflow features several interaction types to support the design goals. For example, direct in-text highlighting is aimed at reducing unnecessary context switching and allows users to decide with low effort whether the patch of text they're reading contains interesting threads. And when the user highlights some text, Thready clips it with its surrounding context while also extracting the references included in it with details from S2, which is shown in the holding tank view in the middle in real time. Underneath, there is a thread selector, so where users can either select from a ranked list of saved and relevant threads or type in to create an entirely new thread. And so let's say if a user saves 2 example threads here, the threads and their structure are saved and can be viewed as the user moves on to the next paper to read, where they can organize the threads into a hierarchy and update the structure to reflect the changing mental model of the space as they go. And the change is propagated to all other open PDF tabs with Thready as well. The user can also add new references from a different paper into an existing thread. And Thready finds recent papers that cite the references included in the thread and ranks them based on citation coverage to help users decide which papers to read next. And so to evaluate Thready, we ran a within-subject study with 9 scientists, and we saw efficiency gains as they could collect twice as more clips and references using Thready than the Google Docs control during the experiment. Their subjective ratings of the usefulness were also significantly higher for Thready than Google Docs in terms of supporting their collection of clips, keeping track of the collected references, organizing the references into threads, growing the threads with new threads and relevant papers, and staying in the flow while reading. Participants commented on how they could focus on threads as opposed to individual papers while reading, which was thought to be helpful for priming and kind of contextualizing their reading with previously synthesized threads. Participants also commented on the flow of reading in Thready, and notably, P1 mentioned that collecting references is such a pain, such a context break, and especially bad when the papers that he tracked down turn out to be not that interesting or relevant altogether, with the damage to his reading flow already being done. So I'm going to just quickly pause here. I think there's a question.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Sorry to interrupt you. Just to understand the definition of a thread, is a thread a set of clips then? Is that a good way of thinking about it?
We kind of defined it as a coherent, so it's usually like a paragraph or maybe a shorter than a paragraph length of snippet of text that includes a number of references that are kind of grouped together by the authors of the paper. So it kind of combines both references and the natural language description of what the important or like interesting bits of commonality about those papers are.
Oh, I see. So it's essentially one clip and references and commentary about why it's important.
Exactly.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so yeah, that's Thready. So while Thready helps, there were remaining challenges as well. For one, users still had to read entire papers to find useful and relevant threads, which is a very manual bottom-up process. And it remained challenging for users to get a sense of related papers and their overall thread-based structure. And so in our follow-up system called Synergy, we were interested in whether thread-based abstractions could be dispatched to automatically find and digest other related papers by leveraging the information and user-curated threads more intelligently to kind of further expand user synthesis. So Synergy's design goals included aiding users' thread-based understanding and discovery by extracting notable threads from papers related to previously saved threads, as well as pre-digesting papers along those saved threads and providing an initial structure that users can overview and build upon. So our insight for Synergy was that threads kind of encapsulate this useful abstraction that binds together a citation context and its references that can act as a useful boundary object, so to speak, between the user's intent and AI's interpretation of the user's intent. So building on Thready, Synergy allows users to highlight a patch of text again that describes a useful research thread that can be used as input to the system. And then Synergy sort of first constructs a two-hop local graph using the references included in the input clip and use the similarity to the citation context as a weighting factor in the message passing algorithm to prioritize papers that have been often cited in similar contexts by other people. So after candidate papers are found, Synergy parses their full PDF text to filter down to most relevant text snippets with citations. Then Synergy uses GPT-4 to hierarchically summarize those into a three-level structure as shown on the left, which users can import to build upon in their own structure. So more details about Synergy information and interaction features include sort of the drag and drop support for individual threads to incorporate them into the outline editor that was provided together for curation, as well as some expendable details about the information sources. So, within subject lab study with 12 scientists and 2 domain experts, we asked them to review the literature on a topic and create a reusable review outline. And we found that Synergy supported both the bottom-up process, where kind of users start by importing system-generated threads, clips, and their references into the editor and organizing that. But also, it seemed to support the top-down process, where users start by creating placeholder for salient threads about a topic in the editor themselves, and then importing relevant sub-threads from the system-generated hierarchy. So the latter seemed to be the case when the user was more knowledgeable about a particular domain naturally. Users felt that the system-generated initial structure was useful in ways that helped them visualize the review outline and think about different threads of research that would go into their review structure, which felt like a higher level thinking to them compared to when reading individual papers one by one and taking notes on each. When domain experts reviewed the helpfulness of user-produced outlines, they found that synergy-based conditions showed the highest overall outline helpfulness compared to GPT-4 generated outlines and outlines generated using the Thready system. And in particular, Synergy helped users to collect more evidence from the related literature, which increased the experts' helpfulness ratings. So Thready and Synergy kind of point to an alternative model or design space to today's kind of paper-centric recommender systems that do not provide direct support for synthesis. And the structure users create today often end up being ungainly and not easy to reuse or grow. So by focusing on thread-level abstractions, future systems might bridge this gap by pre-digesting papers along saved threads and scaffolding extraction and organization with them. I think there's also a rich space for exploration that kind of more intelligently and intentionally integrates both the bottom-up and top-down workflows. For example, initially people, might need doing the work on their own to bootstrap their learning or understanding in a domain. And so thinking about how might this initial learning process could be scaffolded as one side. But once the learning stabilizes, I think the focus perhaps shifts into maybe outlier identification or supporting alternative abstraction or framing and so on, which would then require different design and support for abstraction and user interaction. And finally, there's a large design space around how to support and configure systems to adapt to users' movements between the bottom-up and top-down ends of the spectrum. And so that's concludes Thready and Synergy. I'll just take a brief pause if there's any question. Okay, so far the thread-based abstraction in Thready and Synergy kind of relied on local citation graph signals and content similarity. But in contrast, a lot of novel and outside insights come from cross-domain inspirations that may require more than just local signals. And so in part 2, I'll be introducing a different kind of abstraction, which is the purpose mechanism schema to support cross-domain analogical insights. So kind of to motivate this story, successful analogical inspirations in science really can trigger innovative breakthroughs. For example, what used to be a 50-year-old challenge in aerospace engineering is just a question of how do we transfer a large number of solar arrays into the space for use by telescopes, satellites, and others? One kind of quick or common solution idea might be to make the arrays lighter using some kind of lighter materials, or building a bigger rocket, which is really expensive due to the fuel requirements. But an astrophysicist working at NASA at the time happened to also be an origami expert. And he recognized a deeper kind of structural similarity between folding origami papers and transporting and deploying large solar arrays into the space, despite the obvious surface level differences. One being typically involved with sheets of paper and the other with solar arrays. So this kind of recognizing deeper structural similarities in spite of surface level differences is what we term analogical processing. But analogical inspirations in sciences are rare because analogical processing is often difficult. One reason is that human memory is highly sensitive to surface similarity, which leads us to favor near analogs, and analogical processing that involves just a few relations at once incurs a heavy cognitive load and taxes our working memory. In addition, the number of research papers, just growing exponentially, and the specializations getting deeper kind of makes any one person to become expert across multiple domains. So in this project, we kind of tackled whether development of an interactive analogical search engine that moves beyond surface similarity and processes relations between many papers and various domains at once as feasible. So as a first step for supporting analogical inspirations in sciences, we aimed to find structurally aligned papers, specifically papers that match on the similar purpose as the query purpose. So purpose is like just the kind of problems that that's being solved, and then matching on that purpose while diversifying by the mechanisms of which are being applied to solve those problems. And this has been shown to be a powerful strategy previously for facilitating creative ideation in the product design domain. But it wasn't clear at the moment to us how, or to our research team, how or how much matching on purpose is also helpful for scientific creativity. So our measure of success here was facilitation of creative adaptation over direct application ideas. But what counts as creative adaptation or direct application? To define these types, let's consider an example problem of heat transfer in semiconductors, focusing on interfacial thermal conductance. So here, paper A has a similar purpose to transferring heat, but it looks at more directly controlling thermal, maybe metallic contact conductance. And this may be a novel idea, but something that would be more familiar to the scientists working in that domain, and something that he or she can anticipate a direct application idea out of. So this is an example of direct application. On the other hand, paper B uses different kind of bin structures to deal with the heat transfer problem, though. This is not exactly like the bins is not exactly a familiar domain for the scientist. I think she can understand the concept and maybe come up with a different idea, which is to design maybe nanoscale thin structures for replacing existing or conventional semiconductor walls. So characterized by the novelty and uncertainty, this is kind of an example of creative adaptation. So our first probe system combined human filtering with AI due to kind of noises involved in the AI or the technical stack that we had built back in a few years back. So to filter, kind of find the structurally aligned papers, and we examined using this probe system whether the search results facilitated creative adaptation. So just a little more details about this implementation of this probe. We crowdsourced purpose and mechanism annotations for about 2,000 papers to train a sequence-to-sequence tagger to extract token level purpose and mechanism and from paper abstracts. And then we apply this model to 2 million paper abstracts to predict purpose and mechanism at scale from that corpus. And then we embedded them, the purposes, using the universal sentence encoder. And so when the user query arrives at the engine, we use nearest neighbor search to find papers with relevant purposes, but have different mechanisms. And we also involved human filtering, like I mentioned before, to kind of remove results that were obviously too irrelevant due to some noises that would be giving us kind of unuseful experiment results. And so using the output of this AI and human filtering pipeline, we kind of ran a control experiment that compared the analogy search engine to a more keyword-based EM25 search baseline. And we created, because our goal was to sort of elicit the actual authentic responses from the users, we created a blended list of analogy and keyword search papers, and then asked each one to read each result blind to condition to brainstorm new research ideas. So that constituted our main data source for analysis. And 2 coders coded the transcripts into 4 different types of ideation outcome. So here is shown on the left, as well as 3 different degrees of purpose match on the right. So the middle level purpose match, denoted on the right as part, indicated that the idea had a similar high-level purpose with the query, but differed on low-level kind of specifics and details. So for the first result, we looked at whether analogy papers facilitated creative adaptation over direct application. And to this end, we found that creative adaptation ideas were indeed 2.6 times more prevalent among the analogy papers, while most of the direct application ideas came from the keyword matching papers. Next, we looked at how matching on purpose affects the ideation outcome. And we found that the degree of purpose match kind of mediated how the condition of a paper affected the creative adaptation ideation outcome. Specifically, partial, meaning purposes similar at the high-level abstraction, but differed in low-level detail, resulted in creative adaptation ideas more often in analogy papers than keyword papers. Yes, question?
Yeah,
Yes,
sorry. How are you measuring the ideation of the users? Are you just, is that human assessment of how creative they were?
Yeah, exactly. So we sat down with each user because we were not domain experts in any of those mostly material science guys, but we sat down with them to understand their problem domain, what are kind of their backgrounds and like the approaches that they have taken before, what are the common approaches, and we had a bunch of kind of survey questions in terms of measuring the familiarity familiarity of the idea, like as whether they have seen something or it's similar related to something, or is it something really completely out of their imagination. I haven't seen anything like that before. But TLDR is that we sat down to get the sort of the background information and then independently coded each of the transcripts of the brainstorming session ideation outcomes into those 4 categories. So it was training plus our kind of coder's judgment to categorize it.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So yes, so the extent to which the purposes kind of matched seem to be really important, and especially kind of having some perturbation in terms of how the purposes match, like matching on the high level while differing, having some room for variations in low level specifics seem to be important to encourage kind of creative adaptation ideas. So looking into more details, the relationship between ideation outcome and the degree of purpose match, kind of giving sort of a fuller picture here. In the keyword search condition, when the purpose fully matched, 70% of the ideation outcome was direct application ideas, while it was only 6% among the partial purpose match papers. As the degree of purpose mismatch increased, the frequency of creative adaptation ideas also increase in the keyword search condition to a certain level, but the frequency of creative adaptation ideas was more than double among the partially mismatching analogy papers than partially mismatching keyword papers. But partially mismatching the purpose can be a double-edged sword. So depending on how it mismatches, this may facilitate creative adaptation or just completely render the analog useless. And so this last point especially led us to kind of dive deeper into the challenges involved with knowing what are the important mismatches that are either beneficial or useless for creative adaptation. And so we to understand the challenges kind of identifying what those are, understanding what those are, we conducted interviews with participants, and again, sort of thematically coded the transcripts to find these challenges. The first challenge we found was related to discovering salient structural elements. So when connecting with papers in different domains, participants recognized that their problems may be represented at different levels, but it was not always clear how to express the problem in advance, especially in abstraction. For example, the combination of structural elements or, sorry, was there a question? I think I heard something, maybe, or maybe not. Okay, so the combination of structural elements or constraints sometimes resulted, interestingly, in an unintended intersection of domains. So here P3 said she felt like she was tricking the machine when using popular search engines, because combining the terms like thin film and pressure often led to solid thin films in manufacturing, but what she's really interested in were liquid, not solid thin films, and in the domain of heat transfer, not manufacturing. So importantly, researchers had to see papers with mismatching kind of structures to know which constraints were important, yet implicit in their query, and kind of refine their problem representation accordingly to steer the results. For example, after seeing a bunch of results related to all different aspects of the problem, such as the coding material, size, interface, and fabrication process, etc., the P6 realized that these were all important aspects that he didn't think of because it was so natural to him before seeing the results that kind of distinguished interesting versus irrelevant domains for him. So the second challenge here was related to sort of supporting superpositions of mismatches with just the right amount of variation to find useful results. For example, looking only for the exact purpose matches kind of may lead to missed opportunities, as P1 described here. Fins represented an idea about a typically macro scale heat transfer problems, which prevented her from engaging with that literature and then kind of proactively searching for her problem. But like having been exposed to a paper about fins and kind of deliberately sitting down to brainstorm new ideas, forced her to think about novel designs for semiconductor walls that this traditionally or conventionally macro scale idea could be applied to. But at the same time, too much deviation can make the idea useless, obviously, as commented here by P4. So to conclude, we have investigated sort of the opportunities and challenges involved with building an analogical scientific search engine. And our human and AI analogy search engine found novel papers that kind of facilitated creative adaptation ideas, while purpose match sort of mediated this effect of condition, analogy versus keyword, on the ideation outcome, with some low-level mismatches in analogy papers, particularly leading to more creative ideas. We also identified challenges involved with knowing what mismatches are beneficial to creative adaptation. And so challenge 1 found the iterative nature of discovering salient structural elements. Scientists may need to be able to specify what aspects of the structures are important only after seeing examples of mismatching structures. Challenge 2 found the difficulty of supporting superpositions mismatches with just the right amount. So while too much deviation may break the analogs, too little mismatches may not be sufficient to facilitate creative adaptation in ideation. And so that's the analogical search engine part. So far, I have demonstrated the sort of value of abstraction in 2 different forms, research thread-based and purpose mechanism schema-based abstractions. But what about large language models? They may be able to enhance the value of abstractions. So in the third and last part of my talk, I'll present an ongoing research project about studying the design of interactive inspiration support systems augmented with LLMs. All right, so I'm going to do a quick pause before moving on to the last part of my talk, if there's any question. All right. Oh, yep.
Sorry, I may have missed it, but was there a paper associated with that second part?
Yes. It is called Augmenting Scientific Creativity with an Analogy Search Engine, I believe. It's a Tokai paper 2022. So hopefully you can find it. Otherwise, I can also send you the pointer. Was that Matt?
Yeah.
Hey, Matt. All right. So I guess the last part, for the last part, kind of common challenges with inspiration support systems are in one part kind of a supply side issue with being able to find useful abstractions for transferable ideas to then enable conceptually diverse ideas to present to users. On the flip side, the consumption side, there are also challenges, as we've seen kind of earlier. For example, users' unfamiliarity with abstraction and concepts can lead to early rejection of potentially significant yet counterintuitive ideas. In addition, users may find new constraints in the course of their exploration, which may require dynamic system reconfiguration or adaptation. And so with the advent of LLMs, I think one important open question is how they affect human creativity. On one hand, LLMs seem to excel at helping us generate ideas fast, and this will greatly boost human creativity. But as this new case study shows, human users, when given ideas from LLMs, actually end up generating fewer ideas and of lower originality ideas due to premature fixation. So this really highlights, I think, the importance of careful design and examination into how LLMs might augment human creativity in sort of co-conspirator scenarios. So with this backdrop, in an ongoing project called BioSpark, we were interested in supporting professional automobile designers with analogies found in nature to inspire new design concepts, and specifically how the LLM capabilities may be incorporated into such systems. And so just to give a brief description of what BioSpark is an end-to-end system that consists of back-end and front-end components. For the back-end, an important challenge is sort of getting diverse and high-quality mechanisms from nature that could be useful for design problems. And the existing data sets, such as Wikipedia, is vast but noisy, as many articles do not often contain biological organisms, and those that do often focus on much less relevant species like worms or fungi, and there are a lot of them, I can tell you, and on irrelevant aspects like their biological classification or biochemistry, not the actual mechanisms. In contrast, as nature provides high-quality biological mechanisms curated by experts, but is small, around tens of mechanisms for each functional problem. So to bridge this gap, in the initial BioSpark dataset pipeline, we leveraged LLMs to increase the diversity of generation. And to do so, we devised an iterative kind of tree of life construction algorithm for guiding the LLMs to focus their next generations in areas of the tree that haven't really seen a lot of generation previously. And so we showed the first prototype system to designers in a pilot study, and we found that indeed this seemed kind of directionally promising with new organism species and their mechanisms sparking curiosity. For example, bird feathers were a thought-provoking mechanism for one designer for designing new bike racks, as it challenged the previously held or certain go-to assumptions, such as the rigid materiality often required for the problem in designing new bike racks. However, we also found challenges. One key learning from the pilots was that BioSpark mechanisms kind of lacked descriptions of active ingredients. So for example, though initial BioSpark mechanisms contained sort of broad stroke descriptions, such as the feathers of Galliformes, which is a type of bird, are arranged in a way that optimizes airflow. They didn't exactly tell designers how the feathers optimize where air flows, nor how could they abstract that and use that idea for their own design problems. Instead, a more useful active ingredient description here might be something along the lines of, a flat plane with articulated tips that bend into an aerodynamic shape when at high speed that help people, with imagination of like how they might transfer that idea in more abstract form to other domains. So in that sense, I think active ingredients kind of represent another form of abstraction, which is specifically for mechanisms. And so to focus on this transferable and more useful mechanism abstraction, so we post-processed the dataset, mechanism dataset that was generated with that tree construction algorithm with GPT-4 to summarize mechanism descriptions into active ingredients, like what does what, and then recursively kind of cluster them into pockets of different mechanisms that people could explore. So here's a quick demo of BioSpark. Oops, I'm clicking on the wrong thing here. Okay, so kind of the view interface is structured to show a board view of mechanism clusters on the left and a stream of information cards that correspond to different user requests on the right. So one of them is kind of requesting like a rundown of anticipated design trade-offs. Another could be, as you can see here, sort of requesting more of diverse but related ideas, which we term sparks. So these kind of requests are triaged and kind of show up on the right. I'm going to just move forward a little bit here. And then users might also have sort of follow-up questions or requests, which they can ask. In this case, like how much weight can a silk thread from a spider hold? And then the system will respond with the specific information that might answer that question. And so moving on, so that's BioSpark. So when designing the interaction in BioSpark, we had this question of how we might incorporate, LLMs beyond just providing users with like a completely open chat interface and tailoring that support those support features to the progression of ideation stages. And so we have this idea of an agent that triages user requests written in natural language into 3 different categories of action. One was when users are first trying to understand a new mechanism, the system would support that with like rundown of pros and cons potentially. When users want to come up with new ideas for applying them to a target domain, then the system could help by generating targeted and kind of tailored application ideas. And then when users want to ask follow-up questions about the idea or like anticipate the failure modes and things like that as they dive deeper. The system could also help to clarify any details. And so one quick note on generating kind of diversity sparks. LLM, we prompted GPT-4 with the context of the design problem and the active ingredient description, and we asked it to generate 2 more different ideas. And one trick that we had to do here was to prompt the LLMs with the history of precedents. And so when the user wanted to get more ideas related to a particular active ingredient, we found that the generated ideas were often conceptually redundant. So to mitigate this, we asked the GPT to specifically avoid similar ideas to previous ones, given the precedence history of previous generations, which seem to improve the diversity. As you can see from the result of average pairwise cosine similarity of generated ideas on the left. So that's the kind of inverse measure of the diversity. And so the evaluation of BioSpark is still going on. So I can't systematically speak to how the structured interaction along the progression of ideation stages really benefited the users and on the ideation quality and quantity. But so far, it seems like BioSpark is preferred over the baseline consisting of sort of open chat GPT, chat interface, and apps nature. And the users felt that BioSpark indeed provided more tailored support that helped them beyond just having access to both. And so in summary, through these projects, I've demonstrated how we might reimagine reading and discovery interfaces by focusing on cognitive abstractions. In part 1, systems like Thready and Synergy supported research threads to help people read papers along that abstraction and discover more. In part 2, I developed an analogy search engine based on purpose mechanism schemas to help users find cross-domain analogical inspirations. And lastly, in part 3, I explored how LLMs may be incorporated to augment user interaction and engagement with diverse and unfamiliar concepts. In terms of future work, I am excited to explore topics around how abstraction might be further supported with LLMs and what that might be good for. So thinking of it as a lens for streamlining users' flow of reading, increasing, for instance, the value of new information by making its conceptual relations to prior knowledge more salient, or for personalizing reading using different levels of abstraction, or for structuring outlines for writing tasks. I think these goals are situated within a large design space for systems that kind of bridge in the spectrums. For example, how much of the initiative the system takes and when, between a fully bottom-up or top-down user flows. Also, how interaction with LLMs may be designed in a more structured way, while considering also the potential benefits of open-endedness in the free-form chat interface. And finally, how user behavioral traces can be incorporated for action triaging and intent prediction to improve system adaptability and user productivity. I think one salient value proposition for abstraction is that it is a template patterns that can hopefully generalize. So thinking about its reusability, for example, ways to automatically pull in and digest new papers or new documents at a particular level of abstraction, building on the prior work, such as MASH paper, and further supporting the movements between low levels and high levels of abstraction. Here, an example might be a writing task where it specifies a candidate, the user specifies a candidate section header and a starter set of few references, and to suggest the system suggests maybe the writing outlines, while also recommending an additional reading list that might be useful for bootstrapping the user's learning. So I think more deeply exploring the concept of ambient assistance for abstraction and the use of user behavioral traces is really interesting. So thinking about questions like how might we improve interaction outcomes in terms of its conceptual diversity, when would we intervene if it seems that the user is kind of rabbit holing or getting stuck at a particular idea, maybe helping them break out of that sense of inavailability of how a particular solution may seem fixed for a problem to kind of deeply augment human creativity. And so focusing interaction design on abstraction in future systems, I think, believe opens up a lot of interesting challenges and valuable use cases where people and systems collaborate in the realm of abstraction, kind of to deeply augment human exploration and accelerate innovation. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge all my wonderful collaborators and my advisor, Nikki, for the help along the way. And I am happy to take any questions.
Thanks. Let's thank Hyun-Soo for the wonderful talk. And I believe we have some time for questions.
And so I had a quick question just on BioSpark. How does a user even get started on knowing what question to ask? So if I'm designing a wheelchair, I'm not sure even what question I would ask BioSpark to get biological inspirations.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it touches on this gulf of engagement. I think for the sake of studying this design space and running the experiment, we fixed the design problems as either, design a new bike rack for sedans, because we are actually collaborating with Toyota Research Institute, and they're interested in mobility related problems. And so that was kind of their interest driven thing. The next question, so there were two questions. One of them was like bike rack design. And the other question is sort of, we wanted to inject a little more contrasting or thought-provoking constraints. So like we asked them to think about new wheelchair designs that can also help people go up the stairs. And so that was something that we maybe envisioned, that like the analogies in nature, because there are a lot of animal movement-based mechanisms that people in the field have studied before. We thought maybe there could be a way for them to recognize those connections and being able to apply that or transfer those ideas. And so that was kind of the motivation for us to use that problem to observe, what are some challenges, and can people actually use those bio inspirations to apply to this problem? But I think you're absolutely right. It is kind of concocted in an artificial sort of problem. I'm not 100% sure if people would turn to biology or any kind of domain that's sort of outside of the traditional civil engineering or mechanical engineering for that matter. But I think we should maybe consider that, because I think there are a lot of interesting inspirations, and some of our users did say nice things about the system. For example, one of them was yeah, it just is a great reminder that there's abundance of inspirations everywhere. It's just a matter of how we kind of abstract our way of thinking and kind of getting unstuck in a problem or an approach that we think is the ultimate way. So for that, I appreciate your question.
Thanks.
Pao?
Yeah, so I think great work. So far we have looked into the mechanism that help give people some sort of a spark of ideas in the beginning, right? I wonder whether you have thought about the process of idea generation, or during, say, the iteration process, or explore different options, what kind of mechanism that can be introduced over there?
Yeah, great question. And I know of some of your prior work, Pao, as well as other people's literature in that space. Me personally, we haven't really had a lot of creativity in experimenting with ways to augment that process, the ideation process itself. I know of sequential versus parallel, or many other kind of timing sort of manipulation. There are a lot of I think interesting factors and the experimentation I think we should investigate. Just for, I guess, my PhD research, we really haven't had, we were kind of interested in that spark and the cognitive abstraction. So that's kind of one thing that we drill down on and focus on. But I absolutely agree. And that's something that keeps coming back, or keeps getting raised as we sort of think about deploying this system, or actually making impact with within the context of design teams. I think it's absolutely important for the success of ideation support systems to have those elements and well-designed ways to support that whole process from the beginning to the end. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting and hard problem space.
I guess I have a question about the second paper, the synergy paper. So what really excites me about that paper is it's almost like automating citation tracing, which a lot of researchers do very constantly during literature review. So it's kind of different from the SciC paper where it's like providing you signal and then the user is sort of still manually doing this citation tracing. Synergy is sort of using, I guess, semantic similarity to do automatic citation tracing and presenting you these like broad, relevant topics. I'm wondering if you thought about something that's sort of in between where a model is doing some of these tracing, but there's also user sort of in between to steer.
Yeah, great question. I think that oftentimes it encompasses both and in kind of at different points. I think it's absolutely important for people to start off, at least like if they're kind of new to a domain, for instance, to actually self-actualize and go in there and then kind of deal with the data, or like they deal with the information by actually reading things and digesting things that themselves. They need to have some kind of starting point. And so I can see that being like a one point where it maybe starts off as more bottom up sort of oriented or more kind of learning, encouraging interaction supports that kind of goes in the beginning phase of things. And then maybe once you see like 3 or 4 things that are kind of similar, maybe you have a sense of saturation and you want to kind of move on or expand to other places. That's maybe if we could identify those sort of intent changes or shifts in like how they interact with information or their desires to actually move beyond just seeing the very similar things or like want to go into like a different patch of unexplored things. How could it would then support that, bringing like that understanding to that use space? I think one way is like to maybe filter things that are expected to be useful versus not, like based on some sort of abstraction of like this is something that you have seen and therefore this is like similar to that thing. You probably don't want to look at one more thing of the same kind. Maybe you want to move on to a different part. So I guess maybe it's kind of interleaved, kind of careful sort of support between like supporting that alternating sort of intentions and behaviors throughout the process. But I think it's really interesting to think about, how do we support both? I think because at the end of the day, you want to like to have understanding. I think you need to do the work and then maybe get some help to augment that work. And so at what level is like, abstraction is like useful to kick in more and like being able to dictate the course of action more in the exploration. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's very interesting.
Thanks. I think we're almost at time, unless anyone has any last questions. Okay, I guess let's thank Hyun-Soo again for the wonderful talk. Thanks.
Thank you for being here.